Our bodies have to use digestive enzymes to help us break down food in the gut. And ideally, this happens in our stomach. Digestive enzymes in the stomach break down the food, then the food goes all over where it needs to go in the body. What if there are things we never had the opportunity to learn? We've all been to school or training, but there are things they never taught us that actually make a powerful difference in life. I'm here to share with you all the pieces you've been missing: mindset, health, success, and more. And we'll all learn together from guests along the way. We may not have learned it the traditional way, but oh my goodness, let's keep learning how to do things differently. OMG, Teach Me crew, here we are again. And as I always say, because I always mean it, I am excited for this episode. We are going to shift back to healthy related topics. We've been talking about mindset quite a bit over the last few episodes, so they go hand in hand. Healthy habits, healthy eating, mindset, success, looking great, feeling great. It's all part of it, right? So we are going to talk about gluten today. And what I'm going to endeavor to do for you, this is OMG Teach Me, after all, is not try to convince you of anything pro or con about gluten, but try to give you the full story. Okay, so if you've talked about this with your friends and you're wondering, should you be gluten-free or you eat gluten-free, but nobody understands why, maybe this is an episode that you share with them and they can get a little bit more of the story. Or maybe this is now you getting a little bit more of the story because you are wondering why gluten is talked about all over the place. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to explain what gluten is. Where did it come from? Why is it becoming a big deal? Why is it sometimes a big deal for some people? What are those health issues that we hear about? And then how would you figure out whether it's an issue for you or not? And if it is, what would you do? Okay, so there's our little outline. It really is. I really am teaching today, aren't I? All right, let's start with what is gluten. Besides this word that you hear all the time and that you see mentioned on menus and people worrying about. Okay, so gluten is a protein that is found in wheat, barley, and rye. So it is part of the wheat plant, the rye plant, the barley plant. Gluten is naturally occurring, meaning it has always been in, we're just going to talk about wheat. Just know when I say wheat, I'm talking also about rye and barley. It has always been in those plants. And at the same time, two things have happened recently. So number one, our wheat supply, and when I say our, I'm talking about the US, and I think probably a good part of the Western world is the same, but our wheat supply is very much genetically modified at this point. And even if we're having organic wheat, it still isn't the same plant as what existed 100 years ago. And maybe we need to even go back farther than that, actually, at this point. There are companies out there. I know of one based in Canada, Grainstorm, I think it's called. There are companies out there who say that they have the ancient grain, the ancient plant that hasn't been modified, because quite frankly, there's a lot of cross-contamination as well. So even if a farm is growing organic wheat, there often is at least a little bit of cross-contamination, and you take that over 100 years, we just don't have the same wheat, rye, and barley that we had in the past. And one of the things that has happened is there's more gluten than there used to be. So we're ingesting more than we used to. We're also getting really smart. Here's the second thing that has happened to make gluten an issue. We're getting really smart at creating foods that taste really good and have great textures, and learning how to take apart plants and ingredients and use them to make other foods. And gluten is a great binding agent for processed foods. So it gives kind of a texture and a flavor. It helps things kind of, you can't see me if you're listening to the audio, but I'm kind of pulling my hands apart as if I'm pulling dough. because I can't think of the word. It helps things to have kind of this sticky, springy bagel dough kind of texture. And so now we can actually even take extra gluten out of the wheat and add it into dough so that we get even a more amazing texture. Now, the more gluten that we put in something, of course, the more gluten our bodies have to digest. So gluten has always been there. It is a protein found in wheat, rye, and barley. And some of these things have changed over the last, 50 to 100 years. So, how does that affect our body? Well, go back and listen to the gut health episode, and I will put the link to that in the show notes so that you can easily find it. Our bodies have to use digestive enzymes to help us break down food in the gut. And ideally, this happens in our stomach. Digestive enzymes in the stomach break down the food, then the food goes all over where it needs to go in the body. And the enzyme that helps our body process proteins is called protease, but it can't completely break down gluten. So some undigested gluten makes its way into the small intestine. So gone through the stomach, now into the small intestine, and eventually will come out. A lot of people's bodies can handle this. A lot of people's bodies can't. So it's not ideal that you have undigested gluten that's passing through into the intestines. And at the same time, a lot of people's bodies can handle that okay. And then some can't. So the next question is, what are the issues that cause some people to really not be able to have gluten? Because even if you think the worries about gluten really don't apply to you and you're going to eat whatever you want, that's fine. Your choice, my choice, everybody's choice, right? There are people who really, really, really can't have it. So let's talk about those conditions just so that you're aware. And I'll say if you don't have one of these health conditions, then moderation is really the key here. So isn't that the truth about everything? If our diets consist of bagels and bread and sandwiches and pasta and cake and just, it's like a 1-2 punch every meal, gluten, 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 that's really hard on your body, period, no matter who you are. But if it's mixed in moderation and your body is okay with it, and we're going to talk about a little test you could do to try to figure out how you feel and how gluten affects you, then maybe it's fine. And quite frankly, I've had a few guests on this podcast. I can think of Jessica Mitchell when we talked about cooking healthy, and our first episode of January when we talked about what does healthy mean. I'll link those in the show notes too. So it's better to try to make choices that are pro-health regarding what you eat versus trying to eliminate and trying to be very strict. You do need carbs. Carbs have a function in the body. If we can choose the healthiest carbs, that is amazing. We'll talk about what that means. So typically, moderation is the key here. When is it not? When does it become a problem? Well, that's when we have a medical issue regarding gluten. So you may have heard of celiac disease, and I do know people who are in the older generation who have celiac disease. So it's not something that just appeared out of nowhere in the past 10 or 15 years, although I can understand that it might feel like that. But I do know someone whose husband has been dealing with celiac for maybe 60 years. But remember, I said there's more gluten. We're processing our foods. We're adding it into things. So maybe this is going to crop up more because more people are going to have issues that need to be investigated and maybe find that this is the problem. So celiac disease is an autoimmune response to gluten. This creates damage to the small intestine. And it will usually cause people who have celiac disease, if they eat gluten, they'll have pain, they'll feel sick, they might have bloating, diarrhea, headaches, maybe even skin rashes, interestingly, because when your body has having an autoimmune response, there's a lot of different systems connected there. It could even be a reaction to more than just gluten, just poorly digested carbs in general. But the body is almost attacking itself. You can, if it helps to remember it, this is not scientific wording, but celiac disease basically means that people's digestive systems are attacking themselves when they eat gluten. We don't want that. People with celiac disease absolutely should not have gluten if they possibly can avoid it in anything, because it's damaging their bodies, or their bodies are creating damage when they have it. That is a really big deal. Then you have people who might have an allergy. Now, an allergy to gluten could actually be an allergy to wheat. It could feel the same as any other food allergy. Some food allergies present as really bad stomach pain, some as just really bad indigestion, and maybe it's a sensitivity on the scale there and not necessarily an allergy. Of course, some food allergies create life-threatening responses in the body as well. So if you are having severe pain, severe reactions to eating bread, bagels, pasta, all of these kind of carb things that tend to have gluten in them, please do see a medical professional and get tested to find out, do you have celiac disease? Do you have a gluten allergy? These are a big deal, and they are happening to a lot of people. Maybe something is going on with small intestines in some people where the lining is too permeable, that undigested gluten is getting into the bloodstream, it's causing inflammation. So there's a lot of things going on that you might want to see a medical professional about. So those are the really, really serious issues. It can be celiac disease, it can be a gluten allergy, it can be a gluten sensitivity. And why would we want to eat something that makes us feel bad, right? Just at the basic level. That being said, we don't want to talk really ever about any food being bad or being an evil food. This is a food that is part of a plant that, eaten in its whole food form, for most people is probably okay in moderation. And that statement maybe is something to remember when deciding on what we eat. A food eaten in its whole form that for most people, eaten in moderation, is probably okay. And this is why you hear people talk about whole foods, because we get ourselves into trouble when we start processing foods. So if we actually eat whole grain foods with the balance of gluten and anything else that happen to exist in the wheat in the plant, with as little processing as possible. I recognize we're not going to just gnaw on a stalk of wheat, if that's what you call it, a stalk. I don't know, probably not a stalk, but anyway, with as little processing as possible, that's probably the best way your body's going to be able to handle it as well. We get ourselves into trouble when we start taking things in and out. We start pulling gluten out and putting it into processed foods like crackers, even potato chips, which potatoes don't have gluten in them, but we throw gluten into a lot of things in order to create the right texture, consistency, sometimes even flavor. And those products don't really have any nutritional resemblance to the actual plant. And so I could tell you the same thing about potato chips and potatoes, right? A potato isn't bad. We've done a lot of processing to it to get to a potato chip. Now, I'm not going to tell you a potato chip is bad either. And at the same time, we know it's not a pro-health thing. It's kind of a fun food that we should have, again, in moderation. So the wheat plant, unless you have an allergy, celiac, or a sensitivity, is healthy. The problem is what we're doing to it. We're changing things around. And a lot of times those processed foods have other things going on with them as well, like a lot of sugar, a lot of other artificial things. And they can contribute to blood sugar swings, other health concerns. We're not going to dig totally into the processed foods. Let me pulled myself back from that. But as close to whole foods as possible is always good. Moderation is always smart. Yes, you do need carbs. I am not saying that you can't have any carbs if you are trying to avoid gluten. It's not the same thing. And I promise we'll talk about that. So we now understand who should never have gluten. We know that if you are struggling, if you are having issues, you need to check with a doctor, get tested, see if you have one of these serious conditions. They are real. You're listening to OMG Teach Me because you want to learn how to live well, how to leave the angst behind, maybe some secrets that you never learned in school that might make a really big difference in your life. Well, I have for you 7 days of secrets to living well for free. So make sure that you come check it out. Sign up at www.bit.ly/OMG Teach Me Secrets, and I can't wait to hear which ones you try and which ones make a difference for you. Now, what if you're just trying to make some healthier choices? You're trying to improve your health and you think maybe it might make sense for you to try not eating gluten. So for me, I most of the time don't eat gluten. The way I do that is I most of the time don't eat really white breads and simple processed carbs like that. So for me, it's even bigger than gluten to a certain extent. And again, you'll make your own choice. But how do we know if maybe we would feel better not eating these things? So here's what I recommend you do. Again, not if you're having real medical concerns, pain, real issues, please see a doctor, a medical professional. But if you're just thinking, I'd like to get healthy, I wonder if changing the amount of gluten I eat, the amount of bread, cereal, pasta, all of these things that I eat would make a difference. So the best way to find that out without having medical tests done is to actually take out gluten from what you're eating for 28 to 30 days. So this is a commitment, right? It does take some time. What you want to do is allow your body to completely detox. And if we again use kind of non-scientific terms, we want our bodies to kind of forget about this ingredient, forget about any response to it, get it all out. And I think it takes at least 21 days. So giving it 4 weeks is kind of giving you a little bit of extra cushion there, and then add it back in and see how you feel. And let it be an experiment. Don't let it be a good thing or a bad thing. Let it be an experiment. This is powerful stuff. And in fact, I recommend sometimes that people do this with dairy too, to see, because there's about half the population has trouble digesting dairy. Take it out for 3 to 4 weeks and then add it back in and see how you feel and monitor yourself. So when I say add it back in, I don't mean all of a sudden now breakfast is cereal and lunch is sandwich with a huge hoagie roll and I don't know what else, wheat chips on the side, and dinner is a huge bowl of pasta. Maybe one meal. And then see how your stomach feels, see how your digestion is. Monitor yourself for the first hour after you eat, maybe then 2 hours after you eat, because I'll tell you some interesting things that you might notice. If there is a sensitivity, then you might notice, especially after not having had it for a while, that maybe you kind of do feel a little indigestion-y and a little uncomfortable or a little bloated. And if you don't actually have an allergy, a sensitivity, or celiac, then maybe it's not a health concern, but you get to decide, is it worth it to me to eat these particular foods and just deal with feeling like that, or do I not want to? I'll tell you what I found out for myself about gluten, and it amazes me every time. I found out it makes me sleepy. So I would always get sleepy in the middle of the afternoon. And finally, I realized it was because of what I was eating for lunch. And of course, what's a very typical lunch food? Sandwiches. So I would eat a sandwich for lunch, or pasta left over, maybe something like that. And then in a couple hours, almost like clockwork, I would be sleepy. And I just thought, I don't know, it's a mid afternoon slump. Everybody talks about it. I'll go get my fizz or my coffee or my tea or whatever. That's just how I need to do it. And then that stopped happening when I stopped eating gluten and really, again, stopped eating kind of white carbs, basically. And then when I do eat them, boy, do I notice it because, again, everything in moderation. Sometimes I have a cookie or sometimes I have something that someone offers me because I feel like having it. And I know, okay, like what's going on around an hour or two from now? Is it going to be okay if I get a little sleepy? Then maybe I'll just have that because I want it. Okay. But I know it's going to make me sleepy. And then I had to look into this. Why in the world would that be happening? Well, it's because it is harder for the body to digest. Remember, we said the digestive enzyme doesn't break the gluten down all the way. Some of it goes into the intestines. Well, if our bodies are struggling, because of course we're all different, right? Our systems are all slightly different. If our bodies are struggling to digest something, our bodies are going to pull resources from all over the place. And that pulling of resources from all over the place can absolutely make us tired, sleepy. All the resources are going to the gut. It's possible that we end up sleepy. So, rash, itchy, bloating, sleepy, indigestion. There's a lot of things you can be watching for. Now, if you add gluten in maybe one meal a day and, kind of monitor, kind of see how you feel and you feel fine, you don't have an issue, then maybe it's not a problem for you. And at the same time, I'm still going to say moderation because what we do know is that processed carbs in non-whole grain, well-made bread, in pasta, in cereal, nowadays, not necessarily the healthiest choice to be having them all the time. Because again, we just want to pick foods that are as whole as possible. Our bodies are just going to handle those in the best way. That's what they're expecting. So try it. I'm so curious to know if you notice anything about yourself or if you've tried this in the past. I have helped a lot of people do this and try to figure this out. And some people find that they really don't want to go back to eating these foods. And some people find that they're fine with them. It's about understanding your own body. And it's about giving your own body foods, nourishment, fuel that actually are pro you, pro energy, pro health, pro being able to do what you want to do in life, right? So let's wrap this up by talking about, okay, what if I think maybe that I do want to at least minimize the gluten in my diet? Or what if I've now medically realized that I have to? Then now what do I do? So you have some choices. You can't go to a store or often even a bakery nowadays and not see gluten-free options, right? And if any of you are around my age, midlife, or headed to midlife, maybe you remember the fat-free craze. I feel like this was in the 90s, a little bit into the 2000s, where you could get a fat-free version of everything, right? I was obsessed with Snackwell's fat-free cookies. I was obsessed with fat-free muffins that the bakery in my office building had. There was this peanut butter and jelly fat-free muffin. I mean, in hindsight, how in the world was that fat-free? But anyway, I digress again. Those weren't any healthier than the regular ones. It eventually came out because in order to make them taste good, there was a lot of extra sugar and other stuff in there instead of the fat. Well, a lot of times similar things are happening with gluten-free items. Now, if you have a reason that you cannot have gluten, then have whatever gluten-free items you want, right? And at the same time, I say to everyone, whether it's a necessity not to have it or whether it's a preference, the substitutes aren't necessarily any healthier. So the gluten-free breads, the gluten-free crackers, the gluten-free desserts, the gluten-free, whatever it is, they're still breads, crackers, desserts. They fit in a balanced diet. And at the same time, they need to be proportionally, maybe a smaller part of that balanced diet than vegetables and whole foods and protein. So just keep in mind, even if you're trying to avoid gluten, the gluten-free item, I'm doing air quotes with my fingers if you can't see me, is not necessarily healthier. It's just free of gluten and it has other types of grains in it. And it might I'm making sweeping statements here. It might have more sugar, more salt, just different things to make the flavor good, and the texture might have more fat. It depends on the thing. Okay, so those are options. I just want to make sure you realize it's not necessarily a health food just because it says gluten-free. So what do we eat? Oh my gosh, I've decided that maybe these processed grains and gluten, maybe it's not the best choice for me to eat all the time. So what do you want me to eat? Oh my goodness. There's a few things that are amazing options. Quinoa, which if you don't know what quinoa is, the word itself looks like quinoa. A fantastic, fantastic grain choice. Tastes good, actually has protein, and does not have gluten. Brown rice, another great choice. Brown rice better than white rice because it has more fiber because you're getting the whole grain of rice. Again, whole, right? And then starchy vegetables. And you're going to hear another discussion on this coming up this spring on the podcast. So you can get fiber from vegetables, and vegetables can give you carbs as well. Sweet potatoes, an amazing choice. So there's a lot of things out there that we could be eating instead. So maybe it's doing a bowl or a salad instead of a sandwich. So it doesn't have to be bread-based all the time. Maybe it's kind of retraining our sweet tooth so that good heavens, have something sweet when you want to have something sweet. Fun foods have a place. And maybe they're not always like cake based. Maybe sometimes it's fruit with some type of great flavoring or topping on it, or I don't know what else, pudding, who knows? Maybe just retrain your sweet tooth a little bit. And maybe when you're doing appetizers, instead of diving into the bread basket, maybe it's some type of veggie or fruit-based appetizer or protein-based appetizer. Those things are so good for us. And they can be fun too, like prosciutto wrapped melon. Oh my goodness. Oh, so good. No gluten. And again, we're not saying any of these things are inherently bad. We're saying moderation. And a lot of times the things that we're offered in easy, quick form are not necessarily the healthiest choices for us unless we're doing little bits and we're doing moderation. So all the things you could eat that aren't gluten, so many. Buckwheat is gluten-free, millet, corn, sorghum, teff. These are grains you may not have heard of before. Now, you can eat oats as well, although if you, again, are dealing with an allergy or dealing with celiac, there's a lot of cross-contamination with oats. So it's hard to know if oats are fully free of gluten because sometimes there's, crossover contamination a little bit. Be careful of your sauces because, again, gluten gets added into a lot of things for texture. It's in a lot of soy sauces. You can get the gluten-free version. It's in just a lot of thick sauces. So just be careful, pay attention. It's in some cosmetics. It's in some nutrition products. And again, the question is, how does gluten affect you and your body and your digestion and your energy level? And I will say it's something that should always be used in moderation, not the main basis of your diet, because if it is, you're not getting enough vegetables, you're not getting enough protein, you're probably not getting enough healthy fats. Always moderation. And at the same time, if you're just not sure or you really want to know, is this something that is good for me or not? For me personally, my body, take it out for a while. Try it without. You might discover some things that you really like that have nothing to do with gluten and processed bread type things, and then put it back in and see how you feel. For me, it's been a life changer and honestly changed everything about the way I eat because I learned how to appreciate vegetables more and I learned how to balance my plate in a different way, and just so many positive benefits from trying to figure this out. So I hope this has been helpful in a way that you learned something that maybe you didn't know, and now you get to decide. It's your body. You get to decide. Now you know all the ins and outs. There are a lot of opinions on gluten. Please feel free to have your own. Tell me what it is, actually. Connect with me on social media and tell me what it is. And while we're here, if you have been enjoying this podcast, maybe you hear me say this all the time at the end of every episode. If you've been enjoying this podcast, would you go on Apple Podcasts and leave a rating and leave a review? The cool thing about leaving a review, a couple sentences even, is that starts to tell the app, Apple Podcast, to suggest OMG Teach Me to more people. And they get to learn all this cool stuff right along with you and right along with me when guests are here. So I would love it, love it, love it if you would do that. Thank you so much for joining me and listening in today. And I'll see you next time. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. OMG, I would be so honored if you would take a moment, leave a rating, leave a review, or take a screenshot and share on your social media. Let's get this message out further into the world. Now it's time to head down to the show notes to see the resources I mentioned. We may not have learned this before, but it sure is powerful now.